All right, folks. So today, the short lecture for today, we're going to be talking about Open Borders Chapter 4. This is called Crimes Against Culture. So a couple notes. First off, as I noted over in the chat box, right over there, this is not intended to replace the reading. You still have to do the reading. I've already posted reading questions over in the Discord and on the Blackboard page. So there's going to be stuff that is in the reading that is not covered in this lecture, probably most of it. And there's going to be plenty of stuff that is covered in the this covered here that's not from the book, right? Other stuff I thought was important and interesting, some context I want to give you. And so that will be covered here. And the questions we have for this live stream, for this lecture, are going to cover those things, then not necessarily cover stuff that was in the book. So you have to do both. I know it's asking a lot of you, but reading and then listening to me blather on about something and then answering questions about it is kind of what this whole course is, basically. If you have any questions about this stuff you want me to cover, you can put it over in the chat box, or after this, you can ask on the Discord. I won't be monitoring the Discord while I'm doing this because I only have one brain and one computer in front of me. All right. Again, first off, since this is the middle of the coronavirus, the most important thing to remember is to stay safe, stay the hell at home, wash your hands, distance yourself from anybody else. If you are currently on spring break in South Padre Island or something, then you're a terrible person. And, I should downgrade you for that. All right. So the Crimes Against Culture argument, we've got the Crimes Against Culture chapter. We've got 4 big arguments against immigration. Now, up to this point, we've been talking about arguments against immigration. And the idea, based on the structure of the book, is we set the arguments up and then we knock them down. We say, here's why that argument's wrong. And we're doing that again, except the difference is now we're moving away from economic arguments. Up till now, it's been all economic arguments saying that, all right, here people think immigrants are going to do this to the economy or this to the economy or for jobs or whatever. And now we're moving much more towards cultural arguments. And that's important because people are going to say, okay, even if all these economic arguments are true, that immigration will make us wealthier, it won't necessarily make us happier. It might have all these other add-on effects that we don't like. And that those cultural things are worth a lot of money to us. They're worth a lot to us as a society. And as a result, even if immigration is good for our economy, we might not actually want it because of the cultural effects. And so Kaplan and Weinersmith are going to address 4 different cultural arguments against immigration, and then make one positive case, which we might or may not actually get to here. So we got 4 culture arguments against it. And so the first one is about immigrants increasing the risk of crime, especially the risk of terrorism. The second is that immigration leads to crime from other sources, right? So it might have knock-on effects that lead to crime. The third is an argument that immigrants don't assimilate, or at least modern immigrants don't assimilate. And the fourth is an argument that immigration may tend to undermine trust in society, or affect the level of trust in our society. So let's take each of these 4 arguments in turn and try and give a little context here. Now, what I want to talk about, and the context I want to give this, is we're really talking not just about immigration. We're talking about what we call globalization. So globalization, we mentioned in class before, globalization is an economic process that involves trade between states. And states are trading and their economies become increasingly intertwined. And that's a good thing, right? We go back to Adam Smith and his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, arguing that trade between countries makes everyone richer. And basically everyone accepts that at this point, even though Adam Smith in many of his particulars was wrong. His argument as expanded upon and built up better, perfected by economists like David Ricardo, we all believe this, right? That trade makes everyone richer. So the idea here that Adam Smith is making, the argument is making, is that we're trading with China, and yeah, it's true that when we trade with China, we lose American jobs. But all the stuff we're getting from China is so much cheaper that Americans on the whole are able to buy more stuff. So this we call the GDP, the gross domestic product, is going to increase. Even though we're not making all the stuff ourselves, we can concentrate on making the stuff that we're good at making, and China can concentrate on the stuff that they're good at making. And overall, we all wind up better and richer. Right? We're able to make more stuff. Sorry, I'm just moving my microphone over a little closer. Maybe it can be better. So that's the Smith argument. So we all agree that trade is good. But what Smith didn't really address, which makes sense because he wasn't an economist, because that word didn't exist, really not until the mid-20th century. I won't touch my face. But the he didn't address was the cultural effects of trade. So what it turns out, and this is what Adam Smith didn't necessarily know, is that when we trade with other states, when we move goods and services between states, between countries, we're also bringing all these other things with it. So we're bringing not just goods and services, but the movement of goods and services is going to bring with it also ideas. It's going to bring, so, if I'm importing foods or importing books or importing whatever, I'm going to get all those cultural products along with it. So the culture moves along with it. So when America, we trade with lots of other countries, and so we're going to get their cultural products. And some of that's going to be sushi. We trade with Japan, that's where we get sushi. Or we trade with Mexico, that's where I get Mexican food. Or we trade with Canada, so we get, I don't know, Tim Hortons? Who knows? Anyway, I know they've got really good stuff over there. Don't worry about it. And we don't want poutine. You guys, the Canadians, you can keep all your poutine. For those who don't know about poutine, keep living your best life. You're probably happier that way. Regardless, so when we trade, we get all these cultural movement of culture, and we get movement of people. And those people, the culture, to some extent, moves by moving people. So the more we trade with a country, the more people come along with it. And so when we were talking before, we're basically talking about just the effect of globalization and trade on the movement of goods and services in the economy and the movement of people. And now we're actually also talking about the movement of culture, cultural ideas moving along. So the first argument that Kaplan and Smith are addressing is that immigrants and immigration is going to increase crime, and especially the risk of terrorism. And they addressed something that came up during the 2016 presidential election, and this was called the Skittles argument. The Skittles argument, they had a representation of it in the reading. This was basically an online meme, and it said, okay, so imagine that there is a bag of Skittles, or you got a bowl full of Skittles. And I tell you that in that bowl of Skittles, 3 of those Skittles are poisonous. If you eat it, it's going to kill you. And the question is, would you eat any of the Skittles? Would you take a big handful of the Skittles? And the argument is, well, boy, if I've got a bowl and 3 of them are going to kill me. No. First off, you shouldn't, because Skittles are terrible. They're like M&Ms without chocolate, so why are you doing this? But assuming you like Skittles, and you're wrong, but assuming you like Skittles, you would say, well, no, even if I like Skittles, I'm not going to take the risk that 3 of these are going to poison me. And this was seen as an argument against, at that time, Syrian immigration, Syrian refugees. There's a lot of Syrian refugees, a lot of people displaced by the civil war in Syria. It's been brutal, it's been awful. And so people are displaced. It's actually largely middle-class Syrians that have been displaced. And so they are coming into Europe. And there was a question about how many we should bring into the United States. Now, we talked about before, under international law, we have an obligation to take refugees and resettle refugees. For the most part, we're not actually living up to that obligation at this point, but we have an obligation to do that. And the question is, during the 2016 presidential election, President Trump and his supporters were arguing we shouldn't be taking them because the Skittles argument, right? Some of these Syrian refugees might be criminals or terrorists. And so, oh my God, now we know most of them aren't, but some of them might be. And so we're not going to get a big handful of this. We're not going to admit a bunch of immigrants because some of them are going to be terrorists. Okay, so what's wrong with that argument? First off, again, Skittles are bad. Second, the other thing that's wrong with this argument is, the Kaplan and is saying, is it relies on a degree of innumeracy. Innumeracy, like illiteracy means you can't read. Innumeracy means you can't do math. And of course, Americans are bad at math, but everyone's bad at math. We're especially bad at probabilities. This is why the lottery system works, right? If we all knew how math worked, no one would play the lottery. And that would be bad because, okay, maybe it wouldn't be that bad, but we could take that money, the lottery money goes into education, other good things. So, we want some people to play the lottery. And remember, the lottery is basically a tax on people who don't know math, and maybe we should be taxing them. Regardless. So they're saying the problem with this argument is innumeracy. So it's a bad metaphor to say, oh, I've got 3 Skittles in this small bowl. They say it's more likely, if I've got, it's not that I have 3 Skittles small, I have 3 Skittles in a giant dump truck full of Skittles. Now, if there's 3 bad Skittles in a dump truck full of Skittles, would you still eat the Skittles? Again, the answer should be no, because Skittles are bad. But let's say it was a good candy, M&Ms. If there's 3 poison M&Ms in a dump truck full of M&Ms, would you eat the M&Ms? And you can say, well, no, that still seems pretty risky. But again, that's innumeracy. The reason it seems risky is because you're not putting that risk into context. So the risk of dying in an automobile accident on an annualized basis in the United States is about 1 in 9,000. So if the risk of having a Syrian refugee be a terrorist is less than 1 in 9,000, and in fact, it is way, way less than 1 in 9,000, we're looking at something close to 1 in a million. So if the risk of a Syrian refugee is 1 in a million, and you're saying, well, I can't do it, right? It's too risky. Then you also probably shouldn't be going outside because you might get struck by lightning, or more likely to get struck by lightning, or you shouldn't be driving in a car, or you shouldn't be doing all these other reasonable activities that you do every single day. So we're exaggerating the risk of this particular thing, in this case, Syrian refugees or immigration in general. And I think Kaplan and Smith make an interesting argument for why we tend to do that. And that is that the risk from immigration, the risk of terrorism, we overestimate because it's so vivid. And this is something your brain does, that things that seem vivid seem more likely, right? Because our brains are storytelling machines. The job of our brain is to take the facts around us and build a narrative out of them. So we're always looking for ways to build a narrative. And the more interesting something is, the more vivid something is, the more likely we are to remember it. Simply because it's vivid, we can think it, we remember it, right? So a big car crash seems really vivid. So if that happens, you go, oh shit, big car crash, right? But more commonly, car crashes, aren't that big. Or people think they're going to die in some horrible accident when most of the time when you die, it's kind of in a hospital bed, right? Of some disease like cancer or heart disease. But those things aren't as vivid, so we don't think of them as much. We don't think of them as being as likely. So we have this heuristic in our brains, because we're storytelling machines, that vividness equals likelihood. And that's a problem, because terrorism is super vivid, right? I know most of you are probably too young, but those who were alive during 9/11, we remember the images of those towers falling. It's indelibly imprinted on our brains. It doesn't get more vivid than that. So as a result, that seems much more likely because it's vivid, despite the fact that, well, it's not that likely, right? Attacks on terrorism, especially attacks by foreign immigrants, by immigrants to the United States, are incredibly rare. It's just they're vivid, so we tend to overestimate their likelihood. So that's where the Skittles problem comes from, right? We think immigrants are going to increase terrorism, but it just doesn't happen very often. In fact, in the United States recently, since 2001, and the book, I think, is trying to be overly fair by talking about terrorist acts from the 1990s until the present. I think if we take a terrorist acts from 2005 until the present, over the last 15 years, those terrorist acts have been carried out almost exclusively by Americans, native-born Americans, who are pissed off about something or else, other, or mentally disturbed or whatever, and they're the ones carrying out the terrorist attacks. So our risk of terrorism from foreign actors is incredibly low. It just, we overestimate it because it is so vivid. Immigrants in general, and we're going to move to the second argument now, immigrants in general don't commit very many crimes. And we talked about why this is before. The reason that they don't commit many crimes is because immigrants come to the United States mostly for economic reasons, mostly because they're looking for a job. When they get here, they get a job. And if you have a job, you don't commit many crimes, unless you have a really high-level job like CEO where you embezzle shit, but don't worry about that. So people who are working don't commit many jobs, right? You don't have people saying, boss, I need the day off. I've got a bank to rob, right? It doesn't happen, right? Look, most robberies are happening at 11 a.m. I mean, not right now because we're all at home all the time. Most robberies happen at 11 a.m. You can't have a job and be a robber. It just, the multitasking isn't going to work. So most criminals are doing it because they don't have jobs or they can't get a job, whatever. But immigrants, for the most part, have jobs. Otherwise, they wouldn't have immigrated. Or as we saw with during the Great Recession, and probably the recession that's coming up, when the economy turns bad in the United States, immigrants, especially from Latin America and Mexico, go home because there's no jobs here. So what are they doing? Right? They're not eligible for any of our social safety net programs, so they just go home. So immigrants don't commit many crimes simply because they've got jobs. They've got other stuff to do. So they're actually less inclined to crime than native-born Americans. Now, the good news, is that their children integrate. So the children of immigrants are actually just as criminal as native-born Americans. So, circle of life. And we say the immigrants, so there are some areas where it looks like immigrants might be more crime, right? Immigrants are overrepresented in federal prison. And it looks like, oh, well, they must be criminals. But a lot of those are crimes related to immigration, like unlawful entry. So it's not that they're committing violent crimes at a higher rate. They're committing violent crimes at a much lower rate. Even if there are some crimes like unlawful entry or unlawful reentry in the United States, that they're committing more because you or I, as native-born Americans, could not possibly commit the crime of illegal reentry in the United States. But are there knock-on effects? Maybe, even if the immigrants themselves aren't committing crime, the presence of immigrants leads native-born Americans to commit more crimes. And this doesn't seem to be the case either, right? So the argument here would be that when you have lots of immigrants, you're kind of straining the social fabric of a city or of a state or of an area, and that will lead to more disorder and lead people to commit more crimes. And this doesn't seem to be the case either. Areas with lots of immigrants actually tend to have less crime. And that's probably not because of the immigrants coming in. It's probably because the areas that have lots of immigrants are also the ones that have the strongest economies to start with. That's why the immigrants are coming, right? Immigrants are coming to get jobs, to work. And so they're going to go to areas with strong economies. Areas with strong economies don't have as much crime. And again, the causality here is not clear. Certainly is the case that in some areas, like I'm thinking New York in the late 1990s and early 2000s, really up until today, the crime rate's fallen largely because Well, the economy's gotten really good. So poor people and unemployed people have had to leave, right? We've gentrified crime away. So, maybe it's just the strong economy that's both attracting immigrants and keeping out criminals. So it doesn't look like we've got these knock-on effects where more immigration leads to more crime by native borns or by anybody else. All right, argument number 3 that Kaplan and Williamson bring up. Immigrants don't assimilate. Or, to put it more subtly, old immigrants, like Irish and Italian immigrants, they assimilated. So they were good immigrants. But modern day immigrants, from Latin America or from Asia, well, they're bad immigrants because they're not assimilating. By assimilating, I mean taking on American society, American culture. So this is an interesting question, right? Because we're saying, okay, even if they're good for the economy, they're working jobs, they're helping America, well, but they're not taking on our culture. And the biggest symbol we see of this is language. That you see, people are speaking another language in my country, and that makes me feel uncomfortable. So if you go down to central Miami, right? Miami is characterized largely today by the fact that there were hundreds of thousands of Cuban refugees who left when Fidel Castro took over Cuba. Basically, middle-class people of Cuba got the hell out and came to Florida. And we had very lenient immigration policies. The American immigration policy towards Cuba was the most lenient in the world. Essentially, we said, if you were a Cuban and you got to America, like you landed on the beach somehow, we don't care how, you're a citizen, which is not the way we do it for anybody else. But we were trying to support the Cubans because Fidel Castro was a communist and it was the Cold War. Don't worry about it. So Cubans settled largely in Miami. We talked about Puerto Ricans settled in New York, Cubans settled in Miami, and the Cuban community in Miami to this day still speaks a lot of Spanish. And there are stores you can go into, areas you can go into in Miami where the signs are all in Spanish, right? Not the street signs, but the ads in the stores, the signs are in Spanish. You go into the store, you're going to speak some Spanish. And people go, this seems bad, right? I'm an American. We speak American/English. And so I don't like that people are speaking a different language. Or when I call in customer service, they say, press 2 for Spanish or press 3 for Tagalog, which is either language or the cookie. I can't remember which one's which. Anyway, so that upsets people. And the idea is, even if we're not causing crime, even if immigrants aren't hurting our economy, even helping the economy, that makes me so upset that they're changing my culture, they're changing my language, they're bringing their own cultural practices, they're not integrating, that I'm against immigration anyway. So let's talk about this, right? So the thing we can measure easiest is language, right? Because the U.S. Census Bureau measures it both on a decennial basis every 10 years in the census, which you're probably just got, or monthly, actually, in the American Community Survey. So the question is, do immigrants actually learn English? And we should know, in the past, right, 19th century immigration, immigrants learned English at about the same rate they do now. That is, adult immigrants oftentimes don't learn very much English or don't speak English very well, because when you're an adult, it's really hard to learn a new language, especially English, because English is, let's be honest, a fundamentally dumb language. Our verb tenses don't make sense. Everything's irregular. I know you guys are taking like Spanish class, like, irregular verbs. Like, come on. English, everything is irregular. If you find a regular verb, hold on to it, cherish it, because it's the only one. Also, our spelling doesn't make any goddamn sense. English is a rough language to learn. And that's mostly because English is comprised of words we've stolen from other languages all over the world over the course of the last 600 years. So our language is tough. And so adult immigrants oftentimes don't learn to speak our language well. Now, that winds up being not too much of a problem for them. As we talked about in the past, immigrants tend to follow communities, like communities. So Puerto Rican immigration largely moves to New York, even though New York is farther away than Florida. They move to New York so they can go into communities where everyone's speaking Spanish and even the Puerto Rican dialect of Spanish. So they don't have too much of a problem. So they've never integrated. And we saw this in 19th century immigration, 18th century immigration, where Dutch and Swedish settlers came to the United States and kept on, or German, sorry, it's Dutch, Germans, they came in and had German towns. And Swedish settlers came in and settled in Minnesota and spoke Swedish. And at that time, there was arguments that these people weren't integrating, right? That they had these crazy foreign cultures. Today, we could talk about immigrants from China or immigrants from Latin America. And we get the same responses today that we got 150 years ago to Italian immigrants, that they're not learning the language, right? What Italians, they moved to New York and moved to Little Italy, a place where people were speaking Italian, which is now just one street because Chinatown is bigger. Regardless, the same arguments we've made against integration now were being made back then. And the level of integration, at least as measured by language, hasn't actually changed very much. So immigrants oftentimes don't learn to speak English very well, but their children learn English at really high rates. On average, across immigrant groups, their children speak English well about 80 to 85% of the time. Their grandchildren speak English well 90 to 100% of the time. So as they move on, so immigrants themselves oftentimes don't immigrate, which is why we have these waves of immigration. For the first 20 or 30 years, we go, oh, these people aren't integrating. We're so angry at them. And then after a while, after 40 years, it's their kids, and their kids all speak English. We go, oh, okay, never mind. If you ask immigrants, they do a nice job. I'm gesturing over to the book, which is over on my side over here. If you ask immigrant parents what they're upset about, they're always upset. They never say, oh, darn it, my grandkids just speak Hindi or just speak Spanish. They won't speak it. No, they're always pissed off that their kids do not learn the native language, don't like their original culture. They don't want to eat traditional foods. They want to eat Burger King and go watch dumb movies at the Cineplex like everybody else. So the native languages typically last for about 2 generations. So basically, if you emigrate, you're going to learn to speak. Imagine you emigrated tomorrow to Germany. You would probably learn some German enough to get by, but you still pretty much suck at it because the words get very, very long. And then your kids, they'd speak German pretty well. They'd speak English pretty well. And then your grandkids probably wouldn't speak English at all. They'd just be speaking German. And the same is holding true for immigrants to the United States, right? They don't learn English very well, but their kids learn English pretty well and keep on speaking the original native language, and their grandkids generally don't speak the native language. The group that actually seems to integrate least in this, is Latin American immigrants to places like Los Angeles, Southern California. And it's not that their grandkids don't learn English, it's that their grandkids keep on speaking Spanish for longer because there's lots of Spanish people to speak to. So the big reason the grandkids don't speak the original language that their immigrant grandparents spoke is that there's no one to talk to except for the grandparents. And let's be honest, I know you love your grandparents, but how much do you really talk to them? Because they're not on the TikTok. What do you have to talk to them about? So immigrants do tend to be assimilating at least as well as they were in the past. And we should note, when they don't assimilate, that means they bring native foods over. And we all like those. I mean, no one's saying, oh, what we really like is having, American foods. No, we like having pizza, Italian food, and sushi, Japanese food, and I guess we just call it Chinese food, right? So we like having all these other foreign cultural things come in. If anything, we also steal their words, right? What's the English word for macho? The answer is macho. We just stole the word. So we steal things from their culture. And so it's less that we want them to immigrate, to assimilate, is that we assimilate. We wind up stealing a lot of their culture. All right, fourth argument they're making. That's 4. Okay. Fourth argument they're making about why we might be culture argument against immigration is that immigration may undermine trust. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into this, but the argument is that you need to have some trust in a society. Why? Well, you don't necessarily want a lot of trust, but you want to be able to walk down the street and know you're not going to get mugged. When you go to a store, you want to know that they're not going to sell you something that is necessarily bad, right? That's going to fall apart. So you have to have a certain level of trust for society to function. Because imagine every time you went to a restaurant, you thought, oh, this restaurant's going to poison me. Every time you bought a product, you thought, oh, this product is probably going to be bad. I don't trust this person. If you asked someone for directions and you didn't trust them, then, well, you probably wouldn't ask them for directions. And so trust is important to have in a society. And low trust societies typically are not as economically productive as higher trust societies. So a low trust society is one where you can't really have a lot of economic integration. You can't have a lot of cultural integration because you don't like anybody else. You don't trust them. You think people are going to rob you or steal from you or cheat you. And so it seems to be a problem that immigrants tend to come from lower trust societies and move to higher trust societies. So the United States is a moderate to high trust society. Not as high trust as some other societies like Sweden or the Netherlands. We're a moderately high trust society. And so the fear is if we get a bunch of immigrants coming in from low trust societies, they're going to emigrate to the United States, and then we're going to become a low trust society. And then we won't be able to trust people on the street, and our economic productivity will slow down. And our society will be fundamentally changed. Now, Kaplan and Weinersmith address this. They say, okay, there's a couple things wrong with this. First off, the immigrants who leave, so immigrants from the low trust societies that come to the United States or other high trust societies, tend to be people within those low trust societies that have higher levels of trust. And I think this has more to do not with the level of trust, but rather with economics. That is, we talked about before, the people who emigrate from other societies to the United States or other high trust societies and economic successful societies are the middle class people or lower middle class people, right? It's not the most successful people. It's not the poorest people because the poorest people can't afford to move. Rather, it's the people that are doing okay, but not great. So those people might have higher levels of trust than the people at the very lowest levels of society, right? Poor people don't trust anybody because you probably shouldn't because you're poor. Society's kind of out to get you. And rich people don't trust anybody, but the people in the middle, they have higher levels of trust. And so immigrants tend to have higher levels of trust than the societies that they're emigrating from. What does that mean? Well, that means that the ones that are coming to the United States are not the low levels of trust people. So you wouldn't expect them coming would actually lead us to wind up with lower levels of trust. Second, levels of trust tend to assimilate, much like anything else. That is, when immigrants from a low level of trust society come to a high level of trust society, it's not that they keep their level of trust, rather they adopt the level of trust of the new society. And this makes sense, right? Maybe they didn't think they could trust people back in the old society, but in this side, they're like, oh, this seems pretty nice, right? People don't trust others, not because they're not trustworthy. They don't trust others based on the trustworthiness of those people, right? So trust isn't something intrinsic to you. Trust is something you gather from the society. And that means that we don't have to worry about lowering the level of trust. Calvin Smith makes the additional argument that you probably don't want to be a super high trust society, right? You want to have a reasonable level of trust. Someone who's too trusting, we call naive. So we want to have a reasonable level of trust society. So if we were going to be super high level of trust, and even if immigrants did bring our level of trust down a little bit, that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. All right. With that, I wanted to address those 4 arguments. I see some people are watching live. Everyone else will watch asynchronously, and that's very cool. If you have any questions, you can post them over in the Discord or email them to me if you don't want to post the Discord, or DM me on the Discord, and that'll work just fine. I'll be joining you again probably later today to go over the Emily Bazelon article from the New York Times about sex work. And thank you very much, and I will talk to you online. Have a great day.